For the longest time, the two drivers that we focused on were GDP growth. We have certainly looked at places like China and India versus US in that lens. We have looked between India and China on that lens. We have looked between Europe and so GDP growth, while it's important, and interest rates were the two. I think there is certainly a big focus on what I would call debt to GDP as a third dimension of what the markets are reacting to now. And in US, that has become a big focus. And there is a view that we may think about debt to GDP as important a measure compared to GDP growth. What does that simply mean? That many countries like US may be willing to forego growth to get that other measure right. And I think that is what the market is trying to process is how do they think about the inclusion of these other dimensions that clearly leaders and central bankers obviously over time will think about. And so we have a lot of volatility in the marketplace because we've never had to deal with this before.
Joe Tsai was on stage saying that he is a half glass or glass half full mentality. Yeah. What about you? Is it half empty or half full?
Well, it's half full in certain areas, I would argue. So where I would say where it's half full is I think we are extrapolating how bad growth would be in the world. I don't think so. It's going to be certainly slower than we've seen last year in many economies. But Europe is an interesting example. If you look at what European growth has been over the last few years compared to recently we have seen better growth in Europe, and I do think that will continue. So from Europe's perspective, the glass was literally empty, and it's half full now. And in certain parts of US markets, particularly I would argue in the large cap space, the glass was certainly overflowing. It was more than full, and it's half full now. So I think you have to give context to it. So I think that's a dimension. I think places like Asia are probably also half full. What I think is exciting about Asia, I would argue, is while we think about trade imbalances and what trade wars does, everybody assumes Asia is going to suffer. I think Asia still has a natural consumption pattern that is quite strong. Now, certainly China was very, very weak and it's trying to revive itself. India as a geography has been quite strong. So I would say in Asia on balance is also half full. So I would probably stick with that analogy across the globe.